If you want to help Myth Vision Podcast grow, you can join our Patreon. There are different tiers, as well as help out with PayPal. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Dr. Price, a lot of the comments that I get on Myth Vision go something like this. Not verbatim, but something like this. You're wasting your time. You're reading it wrong. The biblical narrative is allegory, it's a metaphor, it's celestial, it's astrotheology, it's really a secret allegory of the sun, moon, and stars. It has zilch to do with reality. You're reading a Little Red Riding Hood, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Paul Bunyan and the Blue Ox. All it is a story tell that's secretly telling you about the heavenly bodies and the motions of the sun, moon, and stars. For example, our good friend Bill Darlison will look at like Mark, and I think he sees a celestial narrative where the whole thing is cloaked in or secretly talking about the heavenly bodies of the 12 months of the year and stuff like that. So, not to discredit them, okay, but my point is I am going along the path. I once was this person. I must say that I share the empathy with them, because when I left historicist and became a non-believer, so to speak, I went full myth to the core. Like, is there anything in reality here? You know, I even questioned, was it really a temple that was destroyed? Like, that's the length of fringe you start to go in my mind. Like, the whole temple couldn't have been destroyed on 70 AD. That number 70 has a sacred number, so there's no reason in 70 years that, you know, all that. I say that to say, how would you answer someone like that? Like, how do you bring someone to more of a balanced view? Do you think that's an unbalanced view, number one? And number two, what would you do to sway them in a different direction? I'm sure a lot of people who are astrotheology proponents, such as what I was, and I'm not saying there isn't there, they look at it and go, Dr. Price, you're talking about characters that are taking place in a play, and the play is heavens. It's all astrotheology. What would you say to them?
Well, I think there is astrotheology behind a good bit of it, or at least there might be. And I have to think that it's analogous to what happened in the Old Testament. I don't think you can really deny the research of Ignaz Goldziher, who's a great Hungarian scholar of Judaism and Islam and the Bible. He pointed out how the names and features of the various stories make it clear that a lot of the characters, not just in Genesis, but probably mainly in there, are originally astral. That there are various sun gods whose identity as such is pretty manifest from their names. In the case of Samson, it simply means the sun. But other ones too: Moses, Enoch, Elijah, Esau, and so forth. For instance, Esau and Elijah are both said to be hairy men. In the case of Elijah, we assume it's talking about a hair shirt. He's an ascetic. But the hair is a classic symbol for the sun's rays. And there are Moses' shining face when he comes out of the tent of meeting. That kind of fits with Psalm 19, which says the sun comes out of his tent like a bridegroom rejoicing, which Samson does in his story after he's married. And then there are characters that are moon symbols, like Elisha. It makes a big deal about how he's bald. They usually don't go into stuff like that, details of personal appearance, unless there is some kind of a hinting significance. And Elijah, the sun, is succeeded by Elisha, the moon. There's the rivalry between Esau and Jacob. Jacob is said to be a smooth man, not hairy like his brother, and they're competitors for the blessing of their father. Isaac was also a sun god because, like Samson, he's weak and infirm when he loses his sight, when he's blind, no light, etc. And so on. There are a bunch of them. Or look at the things that Samson does. He scorches the Philistines' corn. I live down south in North Carolina, where every summer you hate to see the corn stalks having withered from the sun scorching it. Well, that's what he did. Elijah calls down fire from heaven to consume the Philistine troops. Well, that's like the sun and sunstroke and all of that. So on and so on. You can point out similar things about Hercules, who must have been a sun god also. But that's not all there is to the stories. It implies that at an earlier stage, these characters were simply personified forces of nature. Samson simply was the sun. And but then eventually they made him into a god, and like in the same name attaches to the god of the Moabites, I think, Shemesh or Chemosh. He's a god whom one may petition, and he might answer your prayers and all of that. Just asking the sun not to shine wasn't going to do it. But once they become beings who make decisions, well, yeah, then you can petition them. Then, if you're tending toward monotheism, you might make the god a demigod. He's walking among men on earth, and he is a man halfway, but he's also God, which is why he's so mighty and can do great deeds. And that's how we meet Hercules, Samson, and the others, because the stories about, we talked about this recently, the stories where a woman cannot bear children but is then visited by an angel. It implies that this originally was another case of the sons of God mating with mortal women. So they become demigods. Well, once they become demigods, various stories are told about them that seem to preserve big clues as to where they came from, but it doesn't explain everything they're doing. And they begin to take on a life of their own. So their demigod origin explains why they have superpowers, but not necessarily everything they're doing with them. And I think it's the same thing in the New Testament. The evidence to me, is not quite as clear in the New Testament, even though a lot of things are pointed out. That Jesus in Matthew shines like the sun on the Mount of Transfiguration, but on the other hand, that's derivative from Exodus, where Moses comes out of the tent of meeting, his face shining. Does Matthew know that that was a remnant of Moses being a sun god? He might, but you can adequately explain it by his ever-present theme that Jesus is a new Moses. So the point is not so much Jesus is a sun god as that Jesus is like Moses, even though the Moses thing does ultimately come from solar mythology. And I think there's a lot of stuff like that.
Harry John the Baptist.
That's right, yeah. And
so let me ask you this, probing into that. This is excellent. I'm glad we're getting into this, because this right here can explain also when people talk about, well, you try to parallel Jesus to Osiris. Osiris is so old. Well, what if the author is just paralleling Jesus to Joseph, like I've said countless times, and Joseph is paralleling Osiris, on like a direct parallel in many ways? That makes a lot of sense. So it's not hard with your... Is that called Pesher, or is that called Midrash? Where they use an Old Testament story.
Midrash. Tell another one. Well, there's one fly in that ointment in that Osiris was probably worshipped more widely in the time of the early church than he was in ancient times. There were the religion of Osiris and Isis, which is called the Isis cult, only because it was a religion originally alien to the Hellenistic culture and was imported. Sometimes that's all cult means. The mystery cults were like that. They were imported religions, and that's and so on. It didn't have the idea that we use today. We also have that, like the Hare Krishnas, the Munis. They came from Asia, so they're transplants, they're cults in that regard, but they do also rigidly govern the lifestyles of their followers, and so we use the term cults to refer to that as well, but not so in the ancient world. Okay, so Osiris was still well known and combined with Dionysus, just as MacDonald might, I guess, seem to be arguing that John is kind of combining Jesus and Dionysus. It's hard not to think that with the true vine discourse, for instance.
He's making them a better, just to phrase it in the best way I could, he's pitting them against each other, but making Jesus the better version, the same way he does with Odysseus and all these other characters. So. One other thing about, like, the fact that the Stoics liked to use Odysseus and Hercules as role models for people who really had dogged dedication to virtue and would receive whatever trials they had to face as gifts from God. I don't think that's inherent in the possible astronomical roots of those gods. It really is. It shows that there were moral values that you could pick up from it, whether or not they were designed for that. And I think the same is an Achilles heel of the pure astrotheological idea of the Gospels. There's way too much going on there, the meat on the bones, to say it's all just a code for astronomy, especially. Was astronomy or astrology, same thing back then, was that a secret? I know there were the scribes, some of them specialized in that, but they just flat out described the way they thought the heavens and the heavenly bodies worked in First Enoch and other books. And not everybody had access to those, so it was sort of an elite thing, but was it secret knowledge they had to encode? I don't know, but I'm not sure you would keep that a secret by concealing it in the narratives of the Gospels. But beyond that, there's just too much moral teaching and so on that I don't see how it would come out of astrology. I mean, I'm sure the astrologers were moralists, but I don't see how that part of these stories would. Does the Sermon on the Mount really have anything to do with astronomy? Right.
And so I think that's a big problem with it. Now, that's where you could jump over to just allegorism. Like I think Richard Carrier says, it's all allegory, and I know I've heard that from various others.
Right.
I think that some stories are likely allegories for Christian theology, like the Emmaus story certainly is. You recognize Christ at the Lord's table in the breaking of the bread, though he's invisibly present. I mean, that is a howler of an allegory in that sense, or a symbol, I don't know. Allegory is famously and historically a gimmick to be used to make embarrassing texts look good. Like the Stoics, they believed in the ancient Greek religion, sort of, but they retooled it by saying, well, it's not meant literally. We don't want to have gods that are rapists. So what could it be symbolizing that way? Yeah, he did the same thing, and he said, well, Moses was really saying the same thing that that Plato did, and in fact Plato got it from Moses. Well, it turns out it's just the other way around, right? Moses got a lot of that stuff from Plato of the laws, as Russell Gmirkin points out. But it was like, you mean to tell me it really matters whether or not God wants you to eat mice? Is it really a matter of concern to God what sort of hide you use on this and that drape in the temple? Was God an interior decorator? Come on! And so they would say, well, it really is this and that. And Hellenistic Jews actually, I think, hit on the real point of stuff like that. It's like modern anthropologists say, the point of these arbitrary distinctives was to raise a wall between the people of Israel and their neighbors at a later point, to prevent assimilation. You wanted to create a kind of a symbolic ghetto to prevent dating and marriage and so on. Do
you think the allegorizing of such things is exactly a tool in the opposite direction too? Like, let's break down those walls.
Well, it was for some. Philo condemned Jews who did that, who allegorized it, and then went farther than he wanted to, and said, well, now that we know the point of the symbols, we don't really have to keep the laws.
Literal. Took it literally.
No, those who were such radical allegorizers that said, now that we know the real point of it, we don't need to bother with these charades anymore. And he said, hey, no, they're not just charades. So he wanted to stop right there. That has some relevance to the whole question of whether Paul wanted you to be circumcised or give that up once you were a Jewish Christian. But no doubt that is the Hellenists, like the Epistle of Aristeas. No doubt he was exactly right, and anthropology backs him up that, yeah, this is arbitrary, but really the point was to set up hurdles to prevent contamination and so on. Because if you assimilate, you're going to start getting cozy with their religion, and then you're going to be idolaters and so on. Which is no stupid notion. I mean, the fact that Orthodox Jews oppose intermarriage, is that because they're bigots? No, they're not. The reason is that if there's a lot of intermarriage, you're going to see Judaism get absorbed. It's a tiny minority as it is. There's nothing bigoted about that. Well, okay, so... But allegory was used sometimes to say that this is not what it seems. It's really a more noble, exalted thing, and you resort to that when you're embarrassed by what the text says, but you want to still revere the text as sacred scripture. And I wonder if that's not happening when radical critics say, well, it's not literal, it's not even supposed to be literal. John Dominic Crossan says that. They would have been, the gospel writers would have been amazed that later Christians had taken this literally. I don't think so. They might, and oh yeah, some other things, allegory. There are a few things, like multiplying the loaves and fish, that could be understood as another Eucharistic thing, that the apparently mundane foodstuffs, if they're used as sacraments, impart a whole different, more powerful kind of nutrition to the soul. But like Richard takes some of the story of the Gerasene demoniac as an allegory for pacifism. I don't really see that the military forces are demonic inherently and are overcome. I don't buy that. It's possible, but some of the things he thinks are allegories, I really don't think so. I think that Bultmann was closer to the truth, saying that the miracle stories in the first instance were credentials for Jesus, trying to do what MacDonald is saying John did with Dionysus. In this case, modeling stories about Jesus on older stories of Elijah and Elisha, but in such a way as to make Jesus even better. Anything you can do, I can do better, for propaganda reasons. So he qualifies as the Messiah. Or maybe for pagans to read. You like Apollonius of Tyana? Well, how about this guy?
That's what I love about it, actually. What I'm discovering, and I'm just barely peeping my head through the door, is that it's not just he's making him better than all the Old Testament heroes. He's making him better than any hero. There's not a hero out there that he isn't better than. And why would you do that in a context if it was only focused on Jews?
Yeah.
So you obviously are going beyond the scope of tradition here. And
Plus,
saying,
there were Jews who believed that Jehovah was Dionysus. There's all kinds of syncretism going on too. I mean, they're in I think a 2nd century synagogue floor mosaic. It shows Hercules riding through the zodiac in a chariot. This is not Orthodox Judaism, though it was formative Judaism, as they say. By that time, you didn't have Pharisees. You didn't have Essenes and Sadducees anymore. It was the heirs of the Pharisees, the rabbis. Still, so some of them were like advertisements, like in the Asclepia, the healing shrines of the god Asclepius, who died and was raised from the dead. He would appear to people who would come with an illness or injury, and the priests would say, "Okay, you rest and you sleep tonight in this chamber here, and the god will appear to you and give you a remedy or heal you on the spot or tell you what to do. If you have enough faith, you'll." Like a fraternity stunt. If you do this, you'll be healed. And to beef up people's faith, they had a bunch of clay tablets on the walls of the Asclepium with testimonials from satisfied customers. We've got loads of them, and they're all miracle healings that follow the same basic ground plan as gospel and other miracles. And some of them are so hilariously outrageous. You know they're fiction. Forget about the psychosomatic healing thing. Like a guy comes to the Asclepium who is so blind that he only has empty eye sockets. But thanks to the God, he departs with eyes that work just fine. Oh, come on. And other ones even more ridiculous.
I love that.
And so why? And of course they're trying to drum up business by inculcating faith in the God. Well, that's, to put it crudely, I mean cynically, the Gospels are trying to run up business, not to make money, I don't believe that, but to get people to believe in Jesus. One way you can tell that is in a brilliant study in the great book Tradition and Interpretation in Matthew by Gunther Bornkamm, Gerhard Barth, and Heinz, can't think of his last name. Anyway, a great book of essays. And one of them, I forget which one, does this essay about how miracle stories are slightly different in Matthew from Mark. And he looks at him closely and he says, well, Mark is, let's say, the story of the woman with the hemorrhage interlocked with the woman with Jairus' daughter. In Mark, that complex is longer than it is in Matthew, and that's usually the case when they parallel. Matthew has abridged Mark because he has more stuff to stick in. Well, one of the changes in this is not just for length. Jesus doesn't speak to the woman with a hemorrhage until he turns around and hears her story. I figured if I could just touch the hem of your garment, I'd be healed. Then he says, woman, your faith has made you whole. Similarly, in the Jairus' daughter thing, he is said, I think it's the same thing, he withholds the statement about the healing until it's actually done. And what's the point of that? To say that Jesus will answer your prayers. These we can take for granted. We're all Christians. We know Jesus had miraculous powers. But the point is, if you ask in faith, as these people did, then you're going to get your answer. Similarly, in the stilling of the storm. In Mark, the disciples are indignant. Wake up! What's the matter? We're drowning here. You know, help us bail the thing out. And he says, oh, you of little faith, and so forth. That's the skepticism of the disciples. It makes the deed look all the more impressive when it happens. So that serves a definite purpose. But Matthew sacrifices that to make it a lesson of faith, because now the disciples don't say that. They say, Lord, save, we perish. I mean, that's prayer language. Why? Well, because it's this agenda of, yeah, we know Jesus can do anything. He can leap tall buildings in a single bound. Yeah, but the thing is, you need to prayerfully ask. As James says, ye have not, for ye ask not. And that's the point here. That isn't exactly an allegory. I mean, maybe I'm splitting hairs, but I don't think so. It's kind of an exemplary story, you might say, like the thing where Jesus is going to heal the deaf, mute, epileptic, the son of this guy who's gotten no satisfaction from the bumbling disciples. And he gives Jesus the case history, and he says, if you can do anything, please help us. And Jesus says, if you can do anything? Then the guy says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. That's a classic, though that's already in Mark. There is the most profound statement about faith in the Bible. And who says it? Jesus, an apostle, a prophet? No, just some guy. To me, that is just so powerful. He really gets to the heart of the challenge of faith. Well, I do believe, but this is hard to believe. That is so profound.
I think it's interesting. In John, it's obvious used as a polemic, a psychological polemic here. Blessed are those who do not see, yet still believe. I think that is so apologetics.
He's turned into the audience.
He is literally not even talking to Thomas. He's not even talking to the disciples. They've already seen. Who are you talking to? Nobody's there that you're really talking to but the reader. And that's literally it. So whoever picks up this book is reading this going, blessed are those who don't see. I didn't see it. But I believe. I'll believe it. Because, you know, the story has caught you. It's like a movie. You're like hooked into the 7 miracles. He's already resurrecting guys who are rotting corpses. You betcha I want him to help me out. So, anyway, there's a lot more that could be said on this.
I just got to stick in one other thing.
Go ahead.
I had the great privilege of speaking to the late, great fundamentalist New Testament scholar Merrill C. Tenney. He's another one of these guys who, he's got the apologetical blinders on, but within the space allowed them, they really are scholars who know the text. And Tenney was listing off a bunch of topics that I might want to write about. And he said parallels between 1 Peter and John. Well, one of those is where 1 Peter says, Jesus, this and that, whom you love, never having seen him. Well, that's kind of interesting. It's almost the same sort of thing. And so, I think there's too much else going on to reduce the fictive gospel stories to one. That's totalizing it, as they say. And it's because there are layers to the gospel and there are redactions that have different agendas and are informed by different things.